Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into a story pulled, well, directly from the pages of The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks.
Yeah, think of this as maybe a shortcut to understanding a really remarkable and honestly complex piece of history.
It really is.
It's the story of this woman whose cells became one of the most important tools in medicine, right? And
Hmm.
her family. They lived for decades just completely unaware of her huge contribution.
And the science built on it. So our mission today is to really dig into those sources, pull out the key insights, and look at how this, groundbreaking science crashes into family tragedy and these really profound ethical questions.
Absolutely. And the text is very clear. You can't really start this story with the science bit. You have to start with Henrietta Lacks herself,
Yeah.
the woman, before any lab coats were involved.
Right, before the cells. The sources you shared paint such a vivid picture of her early life. Clover, Virginia. Laxtown, they called it.
hmm Centered around this pretty historic home house, the book says it's a 4-room log cabin that, get this, had actually been slave quarters before.
Wow. And life sounds incredibly tough back then. Hauling water, growing tobacco, hard work.
Oh, yeah. And the sources really detail those trips to the South Boston auction warehouse. The book describes Henrietta and her cousins running around, imitating the auctioneers.
Sort of a childhood memory.
Right, but then the text gives you this really stark contrast. It mentions white farmers sleeping upstairs in lofts, while the black farmers, like her family, they had to sleep downstairs on a dirt floor, in the underbelly of the warehouse, basically with the livestock.
That's quite an image. The book uses that detail, doesn't it, to show the inequality.
Exactly. It really underscores the systemic issues of that time and place. So she grew up there with her cousin, David Day, everyone called him. They later married.
And the book introduces their children, Lawrence, Elsie, Sonny, Deborah, and Joe, who later became Zechariah.
And tragically, the sources detail how after Henrietta died, things got really bad for some of the kids.
Yeah.
The book talks about them being cared for by Ethel and her husband, Galen, and it describes just horrific circumstances, severe abuse, physical violence. And the book mentions Deborah suffered sexual abuse from Galen.
It's just devastating. A whole other layer of trauma. And the source spends quite a bit of time on Elsie, doesn't it? Henrietta's second child.
It does. The text describes her as epileptic, diagnosed with idiocy. That was the term used then. She was committed to Crownsville State Hospital.
Which the book points out was formerly the hospital for the Negro insane.
Right. Henrietta visited her every week, apparently, until she herself got too sick. And years later, Deborah went looking for answers.
And the book says she actually found Elsie's buried medical records at Crownsville. And a photo.
Yeah, confirming the terrible conditions Elsie must have endured there. It's a really harrowing part of the text.
So moving forward in the timeline, the sources track Henrietta and Day moving north, right? Part of the Great Migration.
Exactly. Seeking work, seeking opportunity. They ended up in Turner Station, Maryland. It was one of those communities built up around big industry, Bethlehem Steel in this case. Day got a job there. Like a lot of black men, did tough, often dangerous work.
And it's there, Turner Station, 1951, that Henrietta starts having problems. Unexplained bleeding.
Which led her to Johns Hopkins Hospital. And the sources make a point of saying Hopkins was one of the few big hospitals nearby that treated black patients then.
But the book includes that detail about Hopkins seeing its large, indigent black population as, what was the phrase?
No dearth of clinical material.
Right. It's such a cold phrase.
It really is. It highlights how, vulnerable communities often became research fodder, sometimes without even knowing it. The text also talks about this internal debate going on at Hopkins.
Yeah, between Dr. Talend and others about cervical cancer.
About how to treat it. Specifically, the difference between carcinoma in situ cancer, just in the surface layer, and invasive carcinoma, where it's spread deeper. Talend needed tissue samples to prove his theories about how one turned into the other.
Okay, I see. So Talend believed the in situ kind would definitely become invasive.
That was his big push, yeah. The source explains he was trying to prove it, and studying tissue samples was key to that.
Got it. And that need for samples, that brings us right to the lab down the hall.
Exactly. While Henrietta's getting treatment, George and Margaret Gay are right there at Hopkins, absolutely obsessed with growing human cells outside the body in a lab culture.
Which was super difficult back then, wasn't it?
Incredibly, most cells just died off almost immediately. The Gays were trying to track that, find a way to keep cells alive indefinitely so they could study cancer, find a cure.
And this is the moment. During Henrietta's treatment, a sample of her cervical tissue was taken. The sources are absolutely clear on this point. Zero knowledge, Zero consent.
None whatsoever. And this is where it gets, well, both scientifically amazing and ethically fraught. Because her cells, they were different.
How so?
Unlike everything else they'd tried, Henrietta's cells didn't die. They didn't just survive. The book says they doubled, reproduced a whole new generation every 24 hours, and they just never stopped.
Never stopped. The first immortal human cells.
Ever successfully grown in a lab.
Yeah.
It was completely unprecedented.
That's the big eureka moment. And the sources also credit Margaret Gay quite a bit, right? For the meticulous lab work.
Oh, hugely. Her sterile technique was apparently legendary. The book even mentions her using specific soap brands like Gold Dust Twins to keep everything perfectly clean, prevent contamination. Vital work.
And George Gay.
Yeah.
The book says he called the cells his.
Precious babies. He was ecstatic. There's even this account in the source where Gay supposedly told Henrietta her cells would make her immortal and help people, and she supposedly agreed.
But given she wasn't told about the sample being taken in the first place, that conversation feels complicated.
Very. The context is everything there. So they have these amazing cells, these HeLa cells, as they were called.
Right, HeLa for Henrietta Lacks.
And the way they shared them, described in the book, it sounds almost primitive now, roller drums to grow them in bulk, scientists literally tucking vials in their pockets to keep them warm.
Seriously.
In their pockets? Yeah. Or packing them in ice and sawdust for shipping. George Day, the book says, would even send telegrams warning labs that the cells were about to metastasize to their city. A bit of dark humor there.
Wow. And they spread like wildfire, scientifically speaking. The impact. The sources list so much.
Oh, it's enormous. The book really dives into this. Testing the polio vaccine, absolutely critical. A guy named William Scherer used HeLa to figure out how the polio virus worked in human cells. A massive step.
And then just everything else.
Yeah.
They became the standard human cell line.
Used everywhere. Research on cancer genes, chemotherapy, cloning, gene mapping, IVF, studying radiation, toxins, viruses like HIV, Ebola, you name it. The sources even say they went to space.
To see how cells reacted to zero gravity.
Yep. On early satellite missions. Just incredible reach. The text calls HeLa one of the most important things that happened to medicine in the last 100 years.
And the book makes this other really powerful point, doesn't it? About the timing and location.
It does. It highlights this jarring reality. You have Black scientists and technicians right there at Hopkins using cells from a Black woman to help millions, many of whom were white.
While on the same campus, or at least during the same era.
The Tuskegee syphilis study was ongoing, where treatment was deliberately withheld from Black men. The book puts those two things side by side, and it's a lot to take in.
That contrast is just staggering. And as the science exploded, the sources say quickly became big business too.
Oh yeah, companies jumped on it. Microbiological Associates started mass producing and selling HeLa. The book notes that today, companies make huge amounts selling vials, hundreds, thousands of dollars each, and thousands of patents involve HeLa cells.
All while the Lacks family knew nothing for decades.
Decades. The sources explain how they eventually found out, and it's almost by accident.
Tell us about that. The book describes it vividly, right?
It does. Henrietta's daughter-in-law, Babette, was chatting with a researcher. Turns out he was the brother-in-law of someone she knew. The book calls him Gardenia's brother-in-law. He mentions working with HeLa cells, casually drops Henrietta Lacks' name.
And Babette's reaction.
Just total shock. The book quotes her realization, "Part of your mother, it's alive." Imagine hearing that.
I can. And Day, Henrietta's husband. The sources say he was just confused, scared.
Yeah, his first thought, according to the text, was, did they go dig her up? He'd seen her buried. It made no sense.
And Deborah, the daughter. This hit her hard.
Profoundly. The sources describe her fear, her confusion. She saw these sensational headlines later, read things, and started imagining her mother's cells being used in awful ways, like on the moon or in bombs. It basically sent her on this long, painful quest for truth.
And that quest highlights the huge injustice, doesn't it? The family getting nothing while others profit and build careers. The sources link this to bigger legal fights, like the John Moore case.
Right. The book explains John Moore sued UCLA because they used his cells to create a valuable cell line without his consent.
And here's the really ironic twist the sources point out.
When the court ruled against Moore, saying he didn't own his cells once they were removed, they actually cited the fact that the Lacks family hadn't sued over HeLa as a kind of precedent.
So the lack of action possibly because they didn't even know for so long, was used against someone else trying to claim rights.
It's a really stark example of how established practice, even questionable practice, can shape law, though the Moore case did ignite a much bigger debate about tissue rights that we're still having today.
And then there's the privacy violation, Hopkins releasing her name, her records.
Years before the family knew. The book mentions Patel laws came later to prevent that, but incredibly, parts of her medical records were published again in 2009.
And the sources point out that legally informed consent for using tissue in research is still murky, right?
Yeah, especially if it's not federally funded or if the tissue is de-identified, separated from the name. The sources definitely frame this as a major tension. Scientific progress versus individual rights.
For Deborah, though, the book shows her journey was so personal, finding out about her mother, but also her sister Elsie.
Definitely. That visit to Crownsville, finding Elsie's records, that photo, the text portrays it as deeply emotional, trying to piece together these lost family histories.
And the moment in the lab at Hopkins, seeing the HeLa cells.
Oh, that's one of the most powerful scenes in the book. Deborah looking through the microscope, the text quotes her saying, "They're beautiful," and "all that's my mother," whispering, "Lord have mercy," as she saw them dividing.
And the researcher, Christoph, admitting Hopkins screwed up.
A rare admission, yeah. It meant a lot to Deborah, according to the text, but you also get Zachariah's perspective, unfiltered in the sources.
Anger.
Palpable. Scientists getting rich, the family struggling, can't afford health care. He says it plainly in the book, get rich off our mother and we got nothing.
The sources also touch on all the confusion, the misinformation that swirled around this for the family.
Oh, yeah. The name being wrong initially, Helen Lane, and later those wild headlines about people plants or man-animal cells. It fed Deborah's fears, gave her that Jurassic Park feeling, as the book puts it.
It's understandable how bewildering it all must have been.
Absolutely. And the book shows how different family members try to make sense of it in their own ways. Cootie talking about spirits, Gary believing Henrietta was an angel reborn in the cells, ways to cope with something so far outside normal experience.
So when you look at everything the sources lay out, Henrietta's contribution is just immense, undeniable, changed medicine forever.
Absolutely saved countless lives, powered countless breakthroughs, but the sources are equally clear. The family never saw a dime of financial compensation.
Despite the billions generated, potentially. The book mentions efforts to honor her conferences, museum ideas.
Yeah, but even those sometimes got complicated, created friction within the family, as the text explains.
But what's the focus for the family now, according to the sources?
Education seems key, making sure the younger generations know the story, understand their history, their legacy. That's highlighted in the book as a way forward.
And the story itself, as told in these sources, it keeps pushing that ethical debate forward, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Informed consent, tissue ownership, privacy.
Yeah.
Especially now, with huge biobanks and genetic research.
Exactly. It's not just a historical case. The issues are incredibly relevant today. The text really wrestles with them.
So what's the big takeaway here, drawing it all together from the text?
I think the sources show this collision, right? Incredible scientific progress benefiting so many, but born from a situation involving profound injustice and personal cost to one woman and her family.
Yeah, the legacy isn't just the cells in the lab. It's the human story. The ethics, the lines crossed, the questions we're still asking about medicine, privacy, consent, the body itself in research.
And it leaves you with this big question, doesn't it? How do we balance things? How do we push science forward, which we need to do, while respecting the rights in the context of the people whose biology makes it possible, especially learning from stories like Henrietta's?
What's our responsibility, really? To acknowledge where these tools came from, acknowledge the past injustices, and try to build a fairer future for people who contribute knowingly or unknowingly to medical progress.
Yeah.
It's something the sources definitely leave you thinking about long after you put the book down. A vital story.